Good morning, everybody. My name is John Valeri. I am the practice group leader in the environmental practice group at the law firm of Chiesa, Shinny, and John Tomasi. I'm moderating a panel of experts here on issues related to ESG. As Ray mentioned, this is a very controversial subject. I'll get into that in a second before I turn it over to my panel here. We have a great panel this morning. We have Matt Karmel from the law firm of Karmel. He's the chair of the Environmental and Sustainability Group, and he'll be speaking on the overall legal aspects and legal landscape of ESG, including enforcement and the recent SEC regulations, which you heard a little bit about before from Danielle, and state disclosure requirements. Kyle Strumfels from Langen Consulting is the ESG advisory practice lead, and he'll be discussing essentially what various clients are doing, and as a result of ESG coming out, that's now becoming the forefront of business decisions. And finally, we have Dr. Denise Anderson from Denise Anderson Associates, a public health and healthcare consultant who will be focusing on the ESG side of this from the perspective of social determinants of public health. And for those of us who practice in the environmental field, in particular in New Jersey, those have become upfront, particularly with the passage of the environmental justice law and the recent enactment by the NJBIA of the environmental justice rules. From my perspective, and it was interesting to hear Danielle because I think she comes at it initially from an environmental point of view, and I think for us environmental practitioners, it's really where you see the E and the ESG, and you'll be hearing more that it's broader than that. But basically, the focus of ESG really started taking place in the 1990s with the development of socially responsible indices, into the 2000s, where financial institutions increased its focus on ESG investments, concerns about climate change, in addition to other pollutants. So you've heard Cancer Alley and down in Louisiana, et cetera. But really the focus on climate change has really brought ESG to the forefront, both from an pure environmental point of view, but then the subsequent controversy on issues of investments. CO2 being regulated as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act was something in the mid-2000s, was a thing of controversy until that was settled under the Massachusetts case. You had competing plans, first the Clean Power Plan under President Obama, which was then repealed under President Trump with the Affordable Clean Energy Plan. Finally, you had West Virginia versus EPA that came out from the Supreme Court. And yet, notwithstanding all the regulatory back and forth, there still is a continued push, not only by the investment community itself, but also by corporations that want to engage in responsible investing, particularly in the power industry, to start looking at green indices, et cetera. Again, as you heard, though, there is obviously an anti-ESG pushback. Large state pension funds led by Florida and Texas, but others, have seen ESG as an investing in social change policy rather than financial considerations. And for example, in 2021, Texas enacted Senate Bill 13, which banned state investments in businesses that cut ties to the oil and gas industry. Well, it's an obvious reaction to it because ESG is focused in large part on reducing environmental impact. Florida, as was discussed before, in addition to the policies that were enacted by Governor DeSantis, they recently passed House Bill 3, which bans managers of the Florida pension system from investing in ESG funds and extending it to all state and local funds. And finally, you heard before, and I won't get into it again, the sort of I call the battle of BlackRock, right? BlackRock investment claimed that they wanted to invest in companies that had a zero emissions goal by 2050, and a lot of states pushed back on that, saying, one, our businesses are involved with that, and two, our pension systems should be based upon pure finances and not on social policy. And that's where I think the controversy is really going to continue to lay. So with that, we have a great panel this morning. Let's start with Matt, and Matt Karmel will give us the legal overview.
Thanks, John. So we didn't need to cover what is ESG. We just got a nice primer on all of that. So let's get right into the legal landscape. So what's the most important thing for a lawyer's perspective? It's what is the legal landscape for ESG? We've talked about it being a framework of risks and risk management and policies, but in some of that is voluntary. Some of that's going to be driven by your own priorities, programs, etc. But where does your desire to be more sustainable in that sustainability and profit loop that Danielle had up there, where does it intersect with the law? And that's what I want to talk about, because there's going to be places where it intersects with legal requirements, and there's going to be places where it intersects with legal obligations or risks or things like that. And then it's just going to intersect with legal frameworks. And each of those has a different thing. And I think we tend to think about ESG legal landscape as just being the legal requirements. And that's the first thing on my list. So we're evaluating required disclosures. And what I'm talking about here really is greenhouse gas disclosures, because that's what most people think about first when they think about ESG. And we have the pending SEC rule that's been talked about several times now. There are also pending state requirements. California has a very broad sweeping greenhouse gas disclosure requirement that's pending in their legislature, which could, based on its wording, require a lot of businesses outside of California that do business in some kind of nexus with California to comply with those requirements. Many of you might be familiar with the internet sales tax disputes that happened previously, where you weren't paying sales tax on your Amazon things, and then in some states you are. That's because states have some ability to reach beyond their borders to regulate other states' businesses. And so that is a significant frontier in the legal disclosure requirements landscape. And I think we can expect that California won't be the last. And if the SEC rule does get pushed, I think you might see more states moving forward. And this will be a trend in some of the later slides that I bring up, that states are taking the lead a lot of times in pushing innovative policy, whether it's related to greenhouse gas disclosure requirements or otherwise. But I don't just want to talk about required disclosures, because certainly if you miss a required disclosure, that's a regulatory violation. Your company's in trouble in a way that it doesn't want to be. But what if you're putting out a regular sustainability report? Are there legal considerations with respect to that? And the answer is yes. There are what I call legal obligations. If you are publicizing a sustainability report, procedure, or otherwise, you can be held responsible for those requirements. There are a series of SEC enforcement actions that are posted on the SEC website, where the SEC went after companies that said they were going to invest in a certain sustainable way or do certain sustainable things in their financial reporting documents, and the SEC penalized them. And so that's an instance where I am completely in favor of companies making sustainability statements, because publicizing, getting this out there is one of the drivers. Because you guys are doing this in part, I always sell it as it's partially because your stakeholders want you to do this. And that means you have to publicize it, whether that's your consumers or your shareholders. And then the other issue is the FTC, Federal Trade Commission in the United States, regulates at the federal level environmental advertising. And anything you put in a sustainability report, anything you put in a 10K can be considered environmental advertising, in addition to just claims that are on your products and those types of things. And all of those things are part of your risk of making voluntary disclosures or marketing claims in the ESG space. And we've seen many shareholder lawsuits, class actions from consumers, all of those different types of litigation risks that can really be both litigation and reputational risks for companies. Now, there are many other requirements as well. So we can't just stop at what are the disclosure requirements. The list here is really broad and still is probably 1/100th of the laws that could possibly apply to an ESG program. On this list, I have building decarbonization laws. We talked about how lots of people have buildings. I think everyone in the room raised their hands. New York City, Washington, D.C., both have laws regulating how much energy use a building can use and requiring step downs over time and significant penalties and compliance obligations. New Jersey doesn't have this yet, but this is one of the places where you can expect further innovation at the state level. And just as an example of, okay, we take the sector of E in ESG, environmental, we break that down into energy, one layer down, and then you go even further down, and there's a policy. And so this gives you a sense of all of the different policies there are. We have an S policy on here with environmental justice, but there are many other policies on here that are not on here. This list is much more E-focused. And each company and industry is going to have a unique suite of laws that apply to them. And so that goes to another thing that Danielle said, which is each company needs to do a materiality assessment. When you're doing your assessments, these are the requirements to start to catalog. Your ESG program intersects with your general compliance obligations. So you should already just be thinking about, you should already know really what are all the laws that apply to you and keep tracking them. But as you start to take some more sustainable actions, you'll intersect with other laws and new laws will come out. So I put this map on the screen just to show an idea of how quickly things are evolving. This is an EPR map. So it's showing extended producer responsibility laws across the United States. So if your company manufactures a product, this law shows states which have EPR policies. The lighter the color, the fewer policies. So several states have 0 policies. The darker, the more. Maine, I think, has 7 different policies. It's one of the darkest ones, California. So this just shows you how different policies can be across the country and why you need a very broad environmental compliance program. This is environmental justice, looking at the S portion. We won't get into what all of these means. Yellow means no policy. The other colors all mean some form of policy at the state level. This map is from 2021. I included it just because it is illustrative. This map is colored in a lot more in colors that are not yellow currently. And so it just shows the rate of change as well. So you have to continue to stay on top of these things. Let's take a step, though, beyond requirements to other legal issues for a minute. And there's 3 things that I want to cover. So we've talked at first about sustainability reports. I mean, I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability disclosures, putting all the good things that your company does in a sustainability document to publicize to the world. But there's another trend that I'm seeing that intersects with the law that I think is very helpful, which is internal corporate policies, whether they're externally published or not, that focus on a sector of ESG, whether it's the E, whether it's the S, whether it's called sustainability, whether it's called environmental justice. And these are similar to, workplace discrimination policies and those different types of things. They set forth in a clear and simple manner the policies, decision factors, and procedures that you expect your internal stakeholders to use when considering an issue. And it can be very simple. This is not a step that really necessarily requires a lawyer or a consultant or outside help. It's okay. When we get faced with a key decision, we want to look at these 4 different things. We want to understand the legal landscape. We want to contact stakeholders. It can be that general, but it is really important to put procedures in place. That's why we have workplace discrimination policies and different audit policies, because we want decisions to be made thoroughly and in an automated way, in a way that is reproducible. We don't want too much subjectivity or fluctuation. Although these things shouldn't necessarily be set in stone and feel free to change them, you want them to be set in some way or another. The other piece is contracting. And this is probably not that exciting to many of you. But if you want to get something done, yeah, you can have a supplier that you want them to supply you with a more sustainable product. You say, okay, I use a whole lot of cleaning products in my business. So I'm going to deal with a supplier. I'm going to say, you know what, send me the really sustainable product that you have. And maybe that's in the PO or something like that. But what's the contractual requirement for them actually to do that? And how strong is that? And that's just a really small example. There's actually a free nonprofit project called the Chancery Lane Project, which is an association of lawyers that puts together contract clauses for sustainability and ESG principles and to achieve different ESG goals. And there are so many of them that I do not have time to catalog them. But they really interestingly intersect with lots of different businesses, because let's say you're a major corporation and you have a reporting obligation under the SEC rules in 3 years. Then you need a supplier to give you that information. You need a contract clause to do that. Let's say you want a supplier to reduce their emissions by 30%. You go, okay, I've done the report. You supplier, you have 100 widgets of emissions. I need you to get down to 70 or I have to change. Well, they go, okay, I'll get down to 70. You can actually contract that. So it's important there. It also intersects with the loans, the sustainability loans, all kinds of financing, mergers and acquisitions documents. That's a little beyond the scope of the discussion, but important. And then the last piece that I'll leave you with is corporate structures. There are alternative corporate structures, specifically the public benefit corporations, which specifically by their charter allow the consideration of non-economic ESG principles in business making decisions. They're not just public benefit corporations, there are now public benefit LLCs, and trickling down to all other natures. And that is different than a certified B Corp. A certified B Corp is a specific certification for a public benefit corp. So you can be a public benefit corp and not have a certified B Corp status. The certified B Corp is a independent, non-legal certification process to assure that you've gotten to a certain level with your public benefit. And then that takes me to the question slide in case there are any questions.
Oh, okay.
Can you repeat the name of the organization with the contract clauses?
It's called the Chancery Lane Project. It's got a British sounding name because it originates in England, but they have internationally applicable principles and clauses.
Okay. And we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So I don't want to cut anybody off, but I'd like to move into Kyle's presentation this morning on what he's doing for his clients, what his clients are doing.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I've been an environmental consultant for over 20 years, and mostly in the environmental due diligence space. But it's changed over time. It's really evolved from the old kind of what are the risks if you're looking at like a property or a business to do they have all their permits in place? Are they operating correctly? Do they have legacy issues? To now all of these newer, I should say, issues like, is there a climate risk here? What do their greenhouse gases look like? So we saw this in Danielle's presentation in 3 lists. And this is designed to show sort of like the interrelation of all these things together. I still like the people, planet, profit moniker. I do think all 3 things are important. And I say this at everything I speak at, but there's a 4th P, and it's purpose. So if you put all these things together, like your organization should have a purpose. It should not solely be to make money. Unfortunately, there's also a 5th P now, which is politics, which we already heard about from a few people. So I don't need to go into that too much. But we look at all of these things, say in a due diligence exercise where a company hires us to look at another entity, we may look at every single one of the things on this list. We are better at some than others. For example, there's a data privacy and data security thing on there in the governance section. We're not experts on that. So we can look at a high level and see if people have programs and policies in place, but there are different consultants that'll look very deeply at a company's management of those things. So I deal with a lot of investment vehicles or private equity firms or companies buying other companies. And the evolution over time is one of a negative screening. So what are the issues here? How much are they going to cost to fix? To give me the information and I can see where to add value. So you can see this kind of, it's not just an investor shift, but I think it's a public shift as well. You really want to do business with companies that have good intentions. And we find that companies that are incorporating all of these elements of ESG into their businesses, they make more money. They have better employee retainment statistics. They have more, their supply chains are better managed. The risks are lower overall. And there are studies by McKinsey, and I think the last one I saw, there was one last week from Bain Capital and EcoVadis that just show if you incorporate these things into your business, like Ray said, this is good business, you're making more money. So profitability is part of this whole thing. There's a very small type on this slide. And there's some regulatory stuff. There's stuff about physical and transitional risks, which Danielle talked about. And I'll get to that a little more in the supply chain piece, because I think that may be relevant to everyone in this room. But the last piece on this is important. If you're not doing this, you're falling behind. So if you want to maintain a competitive advantage or gain one, you really need to start thinking about all of these things, or at least what's relevant to your business. You can't do them all at once. You can't ESG overnight, but you can plan things over time, incorporate things here and there, and kind of make it a kind of a smooth running thing. This is about access to capital. So if you own a business and you want a loan, or if you need money, or if you're looking for investors, people who are giving you money or want to put up that money are thinking about ESG. So if you are not, they are going to stop giving you money, to put it bluntly. So if you look at this bar chart, you can see the percentage of money that's going toward sustainable companies. And it only is going to continue to go up. And it's projected that, I think by 2030, 95% of the total of lended money or invested money will be in sustainable companies. The other thing is interest rates. We're all familiar with how interest rates have spiked recently with inflation and such. Well, you can get a better rate with a lot of banks, a lot of lenders, if you have a lot of ESG programs in place. So I think this might be the most relevant thing for folks in this room. If you have a supply chain, or if you are part of a supply chain, this is going to hit you. We have heard that ESG is, in the United States, is voluntary, but it may affect your license to operate. So if you supply a part to Volkswagen or Ford, you will get a questionnaire in the mail, and it will come from Europe, and they will ask you very specific information about your business, and then they will score you on that, and you may or may not continue being a supplier for Volkswagen. So if your business is not diversified, if you don't have parts going to different different manufacturers, or if you solely supply Ford and you're taking cars off a dock and you're parking cars, you have to answer all these questions. You may lose the ability to do business with that company. So you have to really be prepared to answer these questions and find ways to improve your score. And it can be like as simple as like incorporating a policy, or you may not even know what you already have. So it could just be a matter of taking inventory, understanding what's in place. We've seen a few clients that have really robust health and safety policies, and they answer that they don't have one. They just don't know. So sometimes they need a little help from they need outside eyes, because if you look at something every day, sometimes you forget you have it. There's a Walmart picture on there. Walmart, if you want to put your product on Walmart shelves, you have to answer this sustainability assessment. And that involves giving them greenhouse gas inventory information. They're going to need to report that to the SEC when this climate rule gets passed. So that's another thing. The third thing, I think Johnson & Johnson is a sponsor here. I don't have a logo up there, but that 5 box item up there is Johnson & Johnson. If you look at the fourth one, I believe, it says, We will work with our partners to eliminate climate hotspots, and this is a supply chain thing. So if you have emissions that are not under control, or if you are a point in their chain and they don't like the way you look, they're going to work with you on it, but you better be prepared to work with them. So it's just where it's going. Bigger and bigger companies are doing more of these things. So if you're in a supply chain, you're going to start seeing this stuff if you haven't already. The other thing about supply chain is we heard about the Nike example. So reputation for every company in 2023 is pretty much everything. And your reputation can be kind of destroyed instantaneously based on social media or whatever else is happening in the world. And reputation is tied directly to business continuity, which is tied to your supply chain. So everything is kind of interrelated here. If you get all of your raw materials from a single supplier and they're in Florida and they're in Hurricane Alley and there's a hurricane, where are you going to get your supply from? So it's about diversifying. It's about thinking about climate risk and looking up and down your supply chain. I've lived in New Jersey since the 70s. Has anyone ever seen an orange alert before the last 2 days? We have tornadoes now. We have, I live in Lambertville, it floods, every other year. Climate risks are real, they're happening now. We see that we're seeing them now, and it's gonna affect your business and your supply chain. So it's about mitigating, it's about being prepared. And this is just to confuse everybody. There are a lot of frameworks and a lot of different ways to report your sustainability or ESG metrics. I'm just showing you this. There is an effort, mostly in Europe, to consolidate, to make an apples to apples comparison for a framework that can work for everyone. But there are people that report to one of these, to all of these, to different, so they're working on it. Typically what happens is Europe will do something and then we'll follow 3 to 5 years later. So this is all coming, and by the time it gets here, hopefully it'll be more manageable for everybody. And that's it for mine. Again, it's already happening. So we talked about this as kind of an emerging issue, but I think it's here now. So that's
Great. Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to hold questions until our final speaker has spoken, Dr. Anderson, who I think is going to give us, we've all been, I think the three of us who've spoken have been really cut our teeth and still are in the environmental area. And I think, although Dr. Anderson obviously deals with some of that, it's going to be a very different perspective on health issues, et cetera. So a lot of that's become a lot more, like I said, much more front and center with the issues of stressors and environmental justice areas. It isn't obviously the first time that's being used, but it's come to the forefront in New Jersey, at least very recently. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Anderson, who will give her a presentation.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. As John said, my perspective today is as a social scientist and as well as a public health practitioner for over 20 years. And the first thing that I want to say is that ESG and the social determinants of health really provides an opportunity for public-private partnerships. And there is nothing more stitched at the front of our minds right now than the COVID-19 pandemic. The public sector could not have gotten us where we are today without the private sector. Would you agree? And so when we think about beyond the COVID-19 pandemic to other acute, infectious, chronic illnesses, that public-private partnership is still desperately needed. So why should we care? Well, let me at least start with something that I think a lot of businesses in New Jersey and across the nation are facing, which are staffing shortages. Is that right? And so simply stated, sick people can't work. Sick people that are coming into work don't function to the top of their capabilities. And so this is something that we should all care about.
Oh.
All right, well, until the slides come. There has been a lot of talk about environmental, and so I'm not going to, there we are. I'm not going to stay there too long, but I will say that even if your business is not necessarily, contributing greatly to, air pollutants or water contamination, that there still is the opportunity to invest in kind of the mitigation efforts for those things that are happening and the effect on the population, specifically New Jerseyans. Social is all about the people, all right? And we're talking about your internal stakeholders, such as your workforce, as well as your external stakeholders, your consumers, the communities where your businesses are located. Governance is focusing on the structure of the business. I like to talk about it as your company's values, its cores, beliefs, ultimately the belly from which decisions are being made, the way that you anticipate and mitigate risk, your employee protections, your fiscal solvency, as well as the reflection in your business structure of the customers and the communities that you serve. And that is at the board of directors level, that is at the executive level, as well as the individuals that are providing the direct services. So by show of hands, how many people are familiar with this phrase, this terminology, the social determinants of health? That's great. All right. So the social determinants of health are the conditions in the environment that we've been talking about. The conditions in the environment where people are born, where we live, where we learn, where we play, where we work, where we worship, that really affects our health outcomes, our quality of life, our ability to function. Noteworthy is that you're going to see in this slide, those 5 categories, healthcare access and quality is there. But what the social determinants of health tells us is that it's much further beyond just having access to healthcare and the type of healthcare services that you receive. When we're looking at economic stability, we're looking at things like employment and debt and financial support. The neighborhood and built environment, housing is a big issue. Housing is health. It's pretty hard to go to work if you don't have housing. It's pretty hard to, get prescriptions that need to be refrigerated if you don't have housing. It's pretty hard to eat while taking your medications if you don't have housing. Crime and safety, things like the digital divide, something else that we saw during the pandemic, where we were essentially forced to shut down. And there were huge portions of the population that didn't have a device, that didn't have Wi-Fi at home. Social and community context is all about social inequalities, social exclusion, oppressed populations. And when we're looking at education access and quality, we're talking about things like historical underfunding, understaffing, and subpar curriculums, particularly in urban environments. Research shows us that the zip code for which we live in is probably the most prominent indicator of health status. And for the locations of your businesses, not only is this about the health of the community surrounding where your business is located, but it's also about your workforce. So when your workforce comes in and they decided they want to take a walk for lunch, is it safe for them to do that? If they didn't bring lunch from home and they want to patronize restaurants in the area, are there healthy choices for them? So these are the type of things that are both for your internal and your external stakeholders. So when we look at the E of ESG, the environment, this slide illustrates various ways that the businesses can focus on environmental hazards. And we're looking at crime and safety and other initiatives in your ESG work that align with the neighborhood, your built or your physical environment. Moreover, what I want you to see here is that when you see in this slide and the next couple of slides, and my understanding is that everyone will receive these slide decks at the end of today or at some point in time. When you see the more formal language like increase, decrease, we've talked a lot during this panel and with the first presentation by Danielle about metrics. But these metrics actually exist for you. The United States government puts together goals for the health of the nation every 10 years. And so if you look up Healthy People 2030, you're going to see some of these same goals defined for environmental and social initiatives. And so environmental, safe drinking water, things like reducing unhealthy air, making sure that the water that we're receiving have enough fluoride for the oral health of our children. And believe it or not, in New Jersey, probably about half of the counties do not. Looking at blood lead levels in children, right? These are things that, you can choose to take on as your ESG initiatives in the communities where your businesses are. When we talk about crime and safety, first thing is economic stability. That's first. And when we're looking at our youth, we're also talking about, unutilized time and opportunity. And so what can your business do to offer, bridge programs, mentorship programs, summer programs? You don't have to do these on your own. Some of them exist. So maybe it's an investment into existing programs in order to be able to assist in this space. And affordable housing, of course, is another one. When we look at the S of ESG, social and the social determinants of health, it's a lot. We're talking about economic stability, looking at who are you hiring? I hope that you are hiring community members where your business is located. And then what's your policy with ex-offenders? Are you able to adjust your policies? Are there some positions where you can take on ex-offenders? Because we understand that economic stability is key in terms of avoiding recidivism. Can you assist with food insecurity? In New Jersey, we have food deserts, okay? Atlantic City is a food desert. And when we talk about food deserts, we're talking about not having a grocery store chain, right? Really having to depend upon corner stores and bodegas, which tend to be higher in prices, all right? Offer less foods, less healthy options. And so where is it that you can fit into this space? Are you able to partner and help invest to bring a grocery chain in? Are you able to contribute to food banks, food pantries, faith-based organizations that are providing food bags to the population? Can you assist with a community garden, grow fresh fruits and vegetables, greater access to healthy foods? When we're looking at healthcare access and quality, I invite you to look at your healthcare insurance for your population. In the United States, the greater provider of health insurance is through employers. Yes, we have a safety net, but I assure you that safety net, that the access and quality of care, much different, all right? And so when you're looking at that, what's your employee share contribution to the insurance? What do your co-pays, co-insurance, and deductibles look like? Do your health insurance plans offer and cover some of the greatest needs that we're seeing in terms of behavioral health, mental health services, substance use services? Do you offer health screenings for your workforce or even the community surrounding? Partner with the healthcare system to do high blood pressure screenings, diabetes screenings, cancer screenings. These are things that you can think about. And how can you support our youth in education access and quality? Because our youth is the future workforce. And when we look at all of the data that is coming out, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, they're reading below proficiency level. The math is below proficiency level. We're going to see, I predict, that the graduation rates are going to be even lower. They're your future workforce. And so what can you do now to contribute to their overall well-being? When we're looking at the governance, I have to spend some time on this gender pay disparity. And I'm going to ask the women in the room to keep me honest here, because as a provider in my family, I don't get a discount on my mortgage, gas, utilities, car payments. And so that gender pay disparity is something that needs to go away right away, okay? I'll also say that it does not support the way that our families are made up, the differences in families. We have a lot of single female-headed households, and this gender pay disparity really contributes to what we see in the feminization of poverty. And even when it comes to two adult-headed households, a female adult-headed household is going to bring in less than a male and female adult household, which is going to bring in less than a male and male adult head of households. I mean, this is something that needs to change. We discussed health coverage, and so I just want to say that it can be looked at as a part of governance as well as social, depending on how you're seeing it. And then the diversity, equity, inclusion. I include this in governance because when you put it in a social space from my lens, it kind of looks like the way that we talk about DEI initiatives that are on face value versus really being walking the walk and talking the talk. So when it's a part of governance, then I feel like it has the right space that is needed. But when we're looking at this, we're assessing your employee demographics, we're looking at retention, we're looking at turnover rates, pay rates. How do you evaluate your policies and procedures for bias? How do you evaluate your policies and procedures for unintended consequences? How do you communicate with your workforce and with your consumers? And do you take their feedback and actually take action towards it? And then, of course, what type of trainings do you offer? Implicit bias, cultural humility, to name a few. So, by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with logic models? Okay, less. So, logic models are a very good ESG planning, implementation, and monitoring tool. With any initiative that we're offering, we need to have goals and objectives. And in public health, we talk about having SMART T goals and objectives. And what that means is that it's S for specific. We need to know what it is. M, it needs to be measurable, that quantifiable. So whether that is an increase, a decrease, a particular number, a percent, whatever it is that you choose. It needs to be attainable, right? Something that is realistic and within the scope of your efforts. Relevant. It needs to be time bound. So whether that's 6 months, whether that's a year, whatever that is, it needs to be specified in your goals and objectives. And the inclusive and equitable are rather new to this space. And I will admit that sometimes when putting goals and objectives together, thinking about how to include inclusivity and equity can sometimes take time, but I will share with you for a mechanism for myself is that I will back into it. So how do I back into it? When I'm writing a goal and objective, I will ask myself, who is usually excluded from this so that I can make sure that my goal and objective is inclusive. Same with equity. Who typically what population has difficulty in this space, and what is it that they need in order to bring them up to a higher playing field? And that's how I come into the equity piece of it. So on the right of the screen, the basic components of a logic model are inputs. That's your resources, the capital you're putting in, the people, the in-kind services, activities. What are you going to do to meet the goals and objectives? Your outputs are typically the proof of your activities. So as much as we don't like to have them, they're necessary. We'll talk about meetings. So how do you prove that you had a meeting? Well, it's easy. An agenda, written, sign-in sheet. Those are the type of things that are outputs of your activities. And then intermediate outcomes are, medium, a year, 3 years. Final outcomes, impacts are your end changes. They can be 5 years, it can be 10 years, it can be 20 years out. So this next slide is just an example of a logic model template. As you can see, again, what we invest, it could be staffing, volunteers, time, money. Under activities, what we do. This is broken down into who we reach, but instead of who we reach, it could be what are your outputs, the evidence of your activities. And then this one uses 3 columns to talk about outcomes in the short term, in the intermediate, and in the long term. And so learning in the short term, action, intermediate, and then you see conditions. And that final column of conditions is everything that we've been talking about in terms of the social determinants of health. Health, social, economic, civic, environmental. I conclude with providing you some resources for your businesses to learn more about the social determinants of health in New Jersey and for consideration in your ESG efforts. First, I'll say that hospitals typically do a community health needs assessment every 3 years. So you can look at the hospitals where your businesses are located on their websites to see, and you can have a very focused look into what the needs are in that particular community. Next, I provided a host of state agencies and respective topics they have data on. Sometimes that data is at the municipality level, sometimes it's at the county level, sometimes it's both. It just depends. And then the U.S. Census Bureau, the American Community Survey, is another great instrument. It can be stratified by zip codes because remember, the zip codes really determine what the health status of a population is. And finally, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Development Guide. It remains a classic in explaining the use of logic models. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. So we have individuals from NJBIA who are going to have microphones with them if you have any questions. But I'd like to kick it off with maybe more of a philosophical or really a question on where this is going, which is, with the millennial age coming at the age now in both business as consumers, how much is this? How much are we seeing now, and how much of this are we going to be continuing to see as a change based simply on consumerism and employment? And I'll turn it over to anybody.
So from a legal perspective, that's just going to push the voluntary disclosures higher. So if we're not having required disclosures come in, we're going to have voluntary disclosures, and also we're going to have a lot more sort of social policing of company activities, and that'll filter into additional litigation and those different types of things. All of those types of activities.
Yeah, I think it's always kind of the younger generation that pushes for these types of changes. So some people put the origin of the S in ESG at apartheid, South Africa, divesting from entities that invested in South Africa, and then Enron was really the catalyst for the G. But environmental has been the young folks since Rachel Carson. I mean, and even coming to you go to the mid 2000s and Al Gore and there were a lot of people that have pushed this movement, but it's really the younger people that are going to continue to push, and the younger people that are going to see the effects of climate change more than us and their children. And I think it's only going to become more important to consider all of these things to keep your license to operate.
Doctor.
No, I agree with all of that. And I just add that, consumerism is huge. And I think that, the millenniums and the generations after are going to continue to push and make these decisions about where they work, who they want to work for. They're also your future investors, who they're going to invest in. And so, the time is now.
I'm going to ask another question. I haven't seen it. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it. Okay. And this is more directed, I think, to you, Dr. Anderson. All of us who practice in the environmental field, see the numeric. We've talked about bad air days. We know what concentrations are in areas based upon the national ambient air quality standards. We have emission standards. You did mention a little bit about health statistics from the United States government. My sense is if people are going to, or companies are going to be looking at the S and the G maybe, or at least the health side of this, they'll want to compare it to numbers. And I guess my question is how is that developed? How is that space developing, if at all? And where else besides some of the generic health numbers from the United States government can people sort of look at and potentially as a business latch on to?
Yes, I think that looking at the hospital community health assessments as well as looking at the New Jersey state data is going to be able to give you those specifics. I mean, you can look to see any particular condition, environmental, health state, you're going to have that information in terms of the percent of the population, the number of individuals who are, affected, infected. And so if you are choosing to, support a health initiative, support a local health department, you'll see these type of numbers that come out annually. Of course, these numbers tend to lag a couple of years. That's just the honesty behind it, but it is there. Again, even looking at some of the national data, you can still, on the U.S. Census Bureau, definitely track into New Jersey, definitely track into a zip code. And they also tend to publish soft data on a yearly basis so that you can see how things may be changing or not changing.
Anyone else want to comment on that? I was directed to.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's worth looking at some of the environmental screening tools that are available relating to environmental justice, both in New Jersey and the federal EJ screen tool, because they'll show some of the indirect, or maybe that's the wrong word, factors that drive the social determinants of health. Age of buildings, those kinds of things. And if a company wants to look at what are the real world numbers that are driving the health of your employees, then try to address those issues directly through some kind of a means. I mean, like the food desert that Dr. Anderson was talking about, if you're focused on those issues and you can quantify them, you can quantify your response.
Yeah, I'm just curious from a legal point of view, because obviously I've looked at the draft SEC rules, which I'm not an SEC lawyer, so those are interesting reading. When you, again, going back to the numerical part of this, it didn't seem to me that the disclosure rules there had a lot of what I would call numerical meat to it. And that may be because it's not developed. I guess my question is, do we see that coming in either through SEC regulation or otherwise in these other areas besides the traditional environmental area? And maybe it's not there yet.
That's a good question, because you're right, it is coming in the environmental area. I think, Ray talked in the initial about BlackRock making its zero emissions commitment. So that's clearly a numerical pressure going through. And I do think that you'll see that, in a legal intersection, through the company-to-company contracts that I discussed, through, reporting at some point in time, because there will be times where we say, no, we as a country want to get to certain emission levels. And, I think we will get to other requirements as well, other social determinants, aspects, other metrics. But I think I agree with you, they're not quite there yet.
Any other thoughts on that? Questions from the audience? Yes, right here. If you could just identify your name.
Sure, Michael Warwick, Century Business Consulting. I guess this question is a little more geared towards Kyle, and I guess I was interested in understanding kind of on the ESG due diligence piece, what's the entry point with these PE and these M&A scenarios? Are you coming in on the heels of the folks doing the financial due diligence? Are you the tip of the spear? Are you working with folks who do the human capital due diligence? How does that all come together, and where do you guys come in?
Yeah, the answer, it's different on every deal, but we do, the financial tends to be the gate. And once the financial gets beyond a point where the PE firm is happy, then they'll bring all the other work streams in. So usually we're in fairly early, which is nice because when you're only doing environmental, they bring you in after they needed you 3 weeks ago. So it's been a nice change, and we can do both. So we do we cover the environmental and the ESG, and it's dual scope. It's economies of scale. We get eyes on the operation. We're not just doing ESG from our desk. We're talking to people who work there. So it's nice to have that time. It's a luxury for us, really. It's been a nice extra added bonus.
Oh, another, yes, sir.
I just wanted to make one
Oh,
comment.
go ahead.
on
I'm
that,
sorry,
because
Matt.
you are seeing a lot of dual scope things, because I'm seeing it wrapped into legal due diligence as well, where you'll have issues flagged at the consulting level, and then they'll run that through an additional legal due diligence filter at the same time.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning. Ted Deutsch from Taft Communications. We covered a lot of different aspects of ESG all morning. I just want to ask about public reporting. Historically, you've seen social impact reports, DEI reports, sustainability reports, ESG reports. Are you seeing anyone on the panel trends in either consolidation of that reporting or sort of resegmentation of that reporting? What do you think is most valuable for the organization and the public?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah,
Who's going to endorse which standard? Can I take a shot at this? I've not seen a consolidation. Now, some of you may have, but I don't. And part of that may be because everyone has their own view of what. I'm just going to talk from the environmental field. What they're focused on as a business. So, there may be some indices that relate solely to the power industry or to another type of the manufacturing industry. I'm not seeing a consolidation, but I would like to hear everyone else's thoughts on this because that's my initial reaction.
I agree.
And I think part of this is it's new. I mean, maybe not let's put it this way, it's not new on the environmental side. You have 30 to 40 years of environmental regulation. You probably have about 10 to 20 years, as I mentioned before, of indices becoming important. But even with that, there's still not agreement. So now you get to the social and governance part of this, and it becomes a lot more difficult because it's just not a numbers-based thing. I mean, people know how to deal with numbers. So that would be my answer, and I think everyone sort of agrees with that.
I can give you general. So generally, if it's a financial entity, they look at SASB in the United States, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. It's not universal, but most use that. In Europe, if you're headquartered in Europe and you have operations in the US, GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, is the most common. And I think they were one of the first. I think the first GRI report was written in 1998, and it was by Shell, which is a very interesting thing to think of when you think of a sustainability report. And it was written by accountants, very different than what you'd see now. But there is a consolidation effort that's going on in Europe. There's like an integrated reporting thing, and there was like very large corporations in the United States also like almost all do CDP, formerly Carbon Disclosure Project. Some of them do everything, but there's an effort underway so that these reports, you can look at two companies' reports and maybe they have one comprehensive report each and you can compare them. And hopefully that happens.
Kyle, what does the GRI report cover? Is that the E, the S, and the G?
It does,
So
yeah.
I mean, there is some, I think, consolidation that's going on without it being called consolidation. We're just seeing some, comprehensive reporting schemes, those kinds of things. But to the other side, I'm seeing more segmentation, I think. I know there is the consolidation push, but I think people want it to be known that they have reports on some of these sub areas. So if it's just their GRI report, we're talking about consumer stakeholders or different stakeholders, they might not know what GRI is, but if they call it their sustainability report, they know what that is. If they call it their environmental justice report, they know what that is. So I am seeing both things, I think, happen simultaneously.
Yeah, what's nice about GRI also is that it can be assured. So Danielle's company can take it and stamp it and say, this is done to this standard exactly as it should have been. We verified all the information. Here you go. And it includes the negatives and the positives. So you can't just say everything's great. You have to be honest, and they'll stop you if you're not.
And yet it still will be debated.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to use a baseball analogy, all of us old people love baseball. We're into batting average, home runs, and RBIs, and now it's OPS and WAR, right? So, and you hear all the debates over that on a very minor and not important issue and socially. But I think you have the same controversies, right? You're switching you're switching metrics and or competing metrics, and that ends up having its own controversial issues. So the beauty of having a clock in front of you is when you know you're supposed to stop. So I will stop.
And me sneaking up on the side as well. So, I want to thank the panelists. Give them a round of applause.